If you submit this W-2 as proof of your income to USCIS, just know your case is now going to be delayed either by a few weeks or a few months. A W-2 does not prove your income. Your tax return proves your income. So please do not use this as proof of your income. The Affidavit of Support, the I-864, is one of the biggest reasons that green card applications get requests for evidence, because you may not have included enough supporting evidence or the required supporting evidence, or two, you did not fill out the form correctly. I see this consistently because I don't just practice immigration law, I also am a tax professional. So I get to see both sides of it when people are trying to get their affidavit of support through the process, and when it goes wrong and they need help fixing their taxes or help putting together their actual packet for an approvable affidavit of support. Today, I am going to go line by line through the financial traps of the I-864, how to legally calculate your household size, and the exact documents you must have to prove your income. Let's clear up one of the biggest myths when it comes to the affidavit of support. USCIS does not actually care what your current salary is as much as they care about what your tax return for the previous year said your total income was. When it comes to the affidavit of support, you have to meet the actual federal guidelines for your household size. USCIS has it on their website. It's the I-864P that tells you what your household size is and how much money you need to make for that household size. But here's where people kind of fail when it comes to this. You start a new job and you're making $80,000 a year. But in your previous tax return, you only made $10,000 a year. And you think that your $80,000 current income is enough for your affidavit of support. And then you get that dreaded request for evidence. So let me explain why you got the request for evidence. USCIS, when they are considering your affidavit of support, they're not just looking at the current year, they're looking at consistency in your income. What is the likelihood that you are going to continue having that $80,000 income? So if all you give them is your pay stub showing that I'm currently, projected to make $80,000, they're not going to buy it, okay? And that's why you got the request for evidence. Now, if you want to use your current income to show that you make enough for the affidavit of support, you need to put in more documentation. If, like in the example I gave of going from $10,000 to $80,000, that's a dramatic shift in your income. You will need to show more documentation. So I would recommend typically an employment letter, at least 6 months of pay stubs or as many pay stubs as you possibly have had for that job, and a letter explaining the jump in income. Why is it so dramatic? And why should USCIS believe that that $80,000 is going to stay consistent? Now, if you were a student when you were making the $10,000 and now you are an RN making $80,000, that's a great explanation, because now you have a license, and that license leads USCIS to believe that you will consistently keep working as an RN and keep making that income. Now, here's the caveat to all of this that I just said. USCIS can still choose to ignore all of that evidence and still ask you for a joint sponsor or to include your assets for the affidavit of support. It is important to note that an affidavit of support is a legally binding contract between you and the U.S. government, and it can last decades depending on the person that you're sponsoring's situation. You do not want to guess on the I-864. Okay. If your taxes are complicated, if you own a business or are self-employed, if you just started a new job, or if you have any complexity when it comes to your income, you want to work with an attorney that understands not just the immigration requirements, but the tax code to help guide you on the best way to present your income to show that you meet the requirements. You can schedule a strategy session with me where we talk about your situation and figure out the best way for me to assist you. Now, speaking of small business and self-employed, this is another big trap that you can fall into. So if you are self-employed, you may think that your Schedule C is enough to show your business revenue, and your business revenue should meet the requirements for the affidavit of support. But I hate to break it to you, your business revenue has nothing to do with what USCIS is looking for when it comes to the affidavit of support. USCIS is actually looking at your total income listed on the Form 1040 of your tax return. That's what they're looking at to see if you meet the requirements, not your Schedule C. So if your revenue from the business is $300,000, but your profit is only $10,000, then that is not going to be enough, especially if you are also not paying yourself a salary within that business. So if all your profit shows is $10,000, that means the total income from your business is $10,000, and that's what USCIS is going to base your income for the affidavit of support on, not the $300,000. The next biggest trap of the affidavit of support is the household size. This is where people can really trap themselves and end up needing more income than they actually do. Let me give you a quick example. One of the first things it asks you is, how many people are you sponsoring? You put the number in there. Then it asks you to count yourself as one, your spouse, your dependent children, any other dependents you have, and then anyone else that you have filed an affidavit of support for. You need to count them as well. So here's the biggest mistake people make. They count themselves, they count the person they're sponsoring, and then they count their spouse, forgetting, especially in a marriage-based case, forgetting that the person they're sponsoring is also their spouse. So they are now counting their spouse twice, and they're going from a household of 2 to a household of 3, and that's going to increase the income requirement. Okay, so it's really important that you do not make these small mistakes, because you can end up increasing the amount of income you actually need. If you have previously sponsored someone on an affidavit of support, whether it's someone that you personally filed for or you were a joint sponsor for, you need to make sure that you are still counting that person unless they meet certain requirements like becoming a U.S. citizen or having 40 quarters, working quarters in the U.S., and that is determined by the Social Security Administration, not you. And that's typically like 10 years working in the U.S. You need to make sure that you include them as your household size. So I had a client last year and they made $40,000. It was just him and his wife. So he felt he had enough income, and according to the guidelines, he did. So he filed the affidavit of support, and then of course he received the request for evidence. He comes to me, we're reviewing the request for evidence, and USCIS points out, oh, by the way, you sponsored 2 people in the past 3 years. So your income, not enough. And your household is actually 4, not 2. So you see, when it comes to household size, it matters. And you need to make sure that you're paying attention to all the requirements and make sure that you are filling that out correctly, because that is going to make a difference. Either it's going to lead to you needing more income, or you're going to make a mistake and actually put in more than you need. If you absolutely cannot meet the requirements for the income for your household size, you need to do one of 2 things. Either get a joint sponsor or include your assets. Let's start with the joint sponsor. A joint sponsor is someone that makes enough income for their household size that will now include your spouse if you're filing for your spouse, and they need to be able to show that they make enough income for that household size. Typically in my office, we recommend having either a U.S. citizen or a permanent resident as your joint sponsor. You can technically use someone else that is not a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, but they have a legal work permit in the U.S. However, those are typically temporary statuses, and I do not feel comfortable doing an affidavit of support with that because USCIS will question that. So I prefer, if you are going to have a joint sponsor, to use either a U.S. citizen or permanent resident. Again, going back to the caveat, this person needs to understand that they are going to be liable to the U.S. government for at least a decade or until your spouse becomes a U.S. citizen. When it comes to this affidavit of support, it's a legally binding contract, and they need to understand what they are signing. Now let's talk about the assets. When it comes to the assets, you can use anything: money in the bank, bonds, stocks, property that you own, cars that you own. If you're going to use a car, you need to make sure you have more than one car. Okay? If you only have one car, it is not an asset for the affidavit of support. If you own a home, you need to either get it appraised or use your city's property assessment as the value of the home. And remember, it's the equity in the home that's the asset, not the home itself. So if you just bought a house and it is $300,000 assessed value by your city, but you owe $290,000 on that property, your actual asset from that property is only $10,000. Another thing to know about assets is that you can combine assets. So you can combine the $10,000 from the house, another $10,000 from your bank account or your stocks, right? You can combine your assets to meet the requirements. And then the most important thing when it comes to assets is that your assets has to be 3 times the amount you need for the affidavit of support. So for example, let's use simple numbers because the affidavit of support does not have 40,000. It's like 40,200 and something. Let's say the income for your household size, according to the affidavit of support guidelines, is 40,000, but you only made 30,000 the previous year and your income is 30,000 a year. Now you need to make up 10,000. You can make up that 10,000 with a joint sponsor, or you can make up that 10,000 with your assets. But in order for your assets to count, you will now need to show 30,000 in assets, not 10,000. Okay? So remember, assets are 3 times what you need. So the difference between your income and the affidavit of support amount, 10,000. The amount you need to show in your assets, 30,000, because it's 10,000 times 3, 30,000. See, simple math. So that's why I use whole numbers, because we can do simple math here. So now that 30,000 can be a combination of your assets. So the property that has an equity of 10,000. So now you only need 20,000. And then you look up your stocks and you're like, ooh, I'm making money on the stocks. Let me get all my stock information showing that I own it and all of that. That's another 15,000. Now you're only 5,000 short. You look at your bank account, you have 6,000 in there. You meet the requirements. Now you have the 3 times the 10,000, and you need to document that you have that. So if you're going to use a bank account, you need to show at least 6 months of your bank statements showing that you consistently have that amount in your account, especially your savings account. If you are going to use your stocks, you need to make sure you are doing, again, at a minimum 6 months. I prefer a year to show when you bought the stocks and what the current value is. You want to show all of that. All right. So those are, when it comes to the assets, that's what you want to show. And that is going to help you meet the requirements without needing a joint sponsor, or you can use a joint sponsor. So important document. There's one important document that you cannot I repeat, you cannot forget to include with your affidavit of support, and that is your most recent tax return. Okay, your most recent tax return, not the most recent tax return that you filed, but the most recent tax return that is required or that has been required by the IRS. So right now that I'm recording this video, it is after April 15 of 2026, which means you should have filed your 2025 taxes by April 15, 2026. So USCIS is going to be looking for your most recent tax return to be your 2025 tax return. If you filed an extension, you need to show that to USCIS that you filed an extension, and that's why you do not have that document. Okay? But your most recent tax return it's a must. It must go with your affidavit of support, or you will get a request for evidence. Okay? If you are sponsoring, let's say you are sponsoring a parent and you are married and you and your spouse file jointly, you need to make sure that you are also not only including your most recent tax return, but W-2s, 1099s, something to show what your income is if you and your spouse are not sponsoring the person together and it's just your income. You need to show what your income is. So W-2s, 1099s need to be included with that. If you are going to use a joint sponsor, again, most recent tax return, if they are married filing jointly, you need to get their W-2 1099 showing what their portion of their income is, unless they are sponsoring the person together with their spouse. And then you need to make sure that you're including proof of your sponsor's legal status. So whether they're a U.S. citizen or permanent resident, you need to make sure that you have either their U.S. passport, their green card, their naturalization certificate, their birth certificate. You need to include that with the packet because that's what's going to help show USCIS that your sponsor meets the legal requirements to even be a sponsor. And then the most recent tax return, their pay stubs, their W-2s is going to show that they meet the income requirements to even be a sponsor. With the current state of USCIS, you want to make sure that your affidavit of support is done correctly because they are taking steps to not only deny applications because of incorrect affidavit of support, but also taking the additional step to put the person in deportation proceedings. I have seen this happen and people come to me after they have already responded to a request for evidence and didn't include all the evidence that is requested. They went and filed it with USCIS, and now not only is their green card denied, but they are now in deportation proceedings. So this is important, and this is why I'm making this video, to make sure that you understand that it is not just filling out a form. There are actual requirements that you need to meet to make sure that you are protecting yourself and your family through that green card process. If you are preparing your green card application and you're not sure about your affidavit of support, or you just received a request for evidence because of your affidavit of support, please go ahead and schedule a strategy session with me. Let's talk about it. Let's see how I can help you with your process, because not only do I offer a full representation, we do offer reviews and we do offer preparation so we can prepare that affidavit of support packet for you in response to that request for evidence, or we can review what you already put together and make sure that it meets the requirements as stated in that request for evidence so that you are not causing yourself to end up in deportation proceedings for a case that you could have won without that issue. If you would like to schedule that strategy session with me, go to my website, lilylegal.com, click on contact us, and you can schedule a date and time that works best for you for us to talk about your situation.